Chidinma was already breathing, like someone who had been running from something she could not explain by the time she reached the entrance of their compound that afternoon, her swollen feet dragging slowly through the red dust, a heavy bundle of firewood pressing painfully into her neck from where it rested on her head, her wrapper dark with sweat, and clinging to her back where her youngest child slept weakly against her body, while the two older ones followed behind her in silence, too tired even to complain. She paused for a moment at the gate, not because she wanted to rest, but because something inside her chest had begun to feel heavier than the firewood she was carrying. And there, just a few steps ahead of her, under the shade beside the house she had struggled for years to keep standing together, Abel sat, stretched comfortably on the wooden bench, calm, quiet, unmoved, his eyes passing over her and the children the same way one looks past strangers on a road. Chidinma did not speak. She did not call his name. She did not even ask for help, because that afternoon, something inside her was already beginning to change in a way she herself did not yet understand. Sit back as we unveil this shocking story. In the village of Agutane, where the morning air smelled of wood smoke and red earth, and where the sound of a woman's pestle against her mortar was the first language the day spoke, Chidinma Okonkwo had always been known by the same description. Quiet, but the kind of quiet that works. Not the quiet of someone with nothing to say, but the quiet of someone who has decided that saying things takes time she does not have, and so she simply does them instead. She had been the third of 5 children born to a farmer and his wife in the next village over. Her childhood had taught her 2 things well: that life rewards early rising, and that a woman who waits for someone to notice her struggles will wait longer than she has. So she did not wait. She rose before the compound woke, and she worked until the compound slept. And somewhere in the middle of all that rising and working, she had become the kind of woman that a community relies on, without ever formally deciding to the way a bridge becomes part of a journey so naturally that no one thinks to. Ask who built it or how much weight it has been holding. Abel Okonkwo had been different when she married him. This was the truth that sat at the centre of everything. Chidinma carried the knowledge that the man under the shade was not the man she had chosen, and that understanding the distance between who he had been and who he had become was more complicated and more painful than simply being angry at him. The man she had married at 21 had woken up before her. He had been the kind of man who felt urgency in his bones, who understood that a family's stability is built day by day, brick by brick, that it does not assemble itself from good intentions alone. He had worked at a wholesale provision store in the market town, 3 kilometers from the village. He was not the owner, he was a stock manager, trusted with inventory and supplier relationships and the daily rhythm of a business that had been in another man's family for 30 years. It was not glamorous work, but it was honest, and it was consistent, and it paid enough that Chidinma could stop worrying about the week's food before the week arrived. The store closed when the owner died, and the owner's children, who lived in the city, could not agree on what to do, and eventually decided on nothing, which meant closing. Abel lost his position on a Friday afternoon and came home that evening with the particular silence of a man who has just had the ground removed from beneath him and has not yet decided whether he will fall or find another surface to stand on. He searched for work, For several months he walked to different establishments in the market town and the next town over, coming home each evening with nothing but the tiredness of a man who has spent the day knocking on doors that do not open. Chidinma encouraged him through all of this, had cooked his favourite soup when she could afford the ingredients, had told him patience was not failure, had believed, genuinely believed, that the search would end with something. But the months stretched. And somewhere in the stretching, something in Abel quietly gave way. Shame is a strange wound. It does not announce itself. It enters quietly, disguises itself as rest, and slowly convinces a man that if he is not moving, at least no one can see him fail. He began spending more time in the compound, then more time with a group of men who gathered near the mechanic's shed at the edge of the village, men who were also not working, and who had built around their collective idleness a culture of conversation and companionship that was warm enough to feel like something even when it was producing nothing. Chidinma watched this happen the way you watch weather change, knowing what is coming, unable to stop it, making the adjustments a person makes when they understand that the storm will arrive regardless of their preferences. She simply absorbed the shift in responsibility the way she absorbed everything else quietly, completely, and at considerable cost to herself. By the time their third child arrived, the one she now carried sleeping against her back, Chidinma had been carrying the household alone for nearly 2 years. 2 years of early mornings and late nights, and the particular arithmetic of a woman stretching insufficient resources across the non-negotiable needs of 3 small children. 2 years of firewood and cassava and the roadside market and the school fees that were always slightly more than she had managed to save. The children were her reason for everything. Chukwuemeka, the eldest, was 7. Ada, the middle child, was 5, and prone to watching her parents with an attention that was unnerving in its steadiness, as though she was storing information for a time when she would need it. And the baby, Nkechi, barely 8 months old, knew nothing except the warmth of her mother's back and the sound of her mother's heartbeat and the particular safety of a body that had never once put her down. It was for these 3 that Chidinma endured, not from an absence of self-respect, but from an excess of love. She had decided that her children would not feel the full weight of their father's failure if she could stand between them and it. What she had not calculated was the cost of that holding. What she had not understood was that a buffer is not infinite. That endurance, no matter how genuine, has a physical limit, and that the body, unlike the spirit, does not negotiate. Life in the compound tightened like a rope that has been loaded gradually each week, bringing a new weight that by itself would have been manageable, but that, added to all the previous weeks, became something the rope was no longer designed to hold. The school fees came first. Chukwuemeka's class teacher sent a note home 3 weeks of unpaid fees. The child would not be allowed to sit for the upcoming assessment if the balance was not settled. Chidinma read the note twice, folded it carefully, and put it in the pocket of her wrapper. She did not show it to Abel. She had learned that showing Abel problems did not produce solutions. It produced either silence or half-formed promises that dissipated by morning. She handled the fees by selling the basket of dried stockfish she had been storing to sell at a higher price during the festive season. It was not the right time to sell, and the price she got reflected this. But Chukwuemeka returned to school on the Monday with his assessment fee paid and his mother's sacrifice folded invisibly into the receipt his teacher issued. Then the landlord came. Mazi Chukwudi stood at the gate with the courtesy of a man who respects the people he must nonetheless hold accountable, and said that 3 months of rent was outstanding. Chidinma thanked him. She told him she would handle it. She did not know how, but she told him this because the alternative felt like a surrender she could not afford in front of a witness. The following week, she took on washing for 2 more families. Her hands were already roughened from the farm work and the firewood, and the additional washing left them cracked at the knuckles, small wounds that stung in the cool morning water and ached at night. She did not mention this to anyone. A woman who carries everything in silence teaches the people around her that she needs nothing. This is not strength. This is a very slow and very quiet kind of disappearing. Abel was aware of the rent. He was aware of the school fees. He was aware of all of it, the way a person is aware of a piece of music playing in another room present in his consciousness, but not demanding his engagement. He had constructed around himself a careful architecture of avoidance, looking away at the right moments, leaving the compound before difficult conversations could begin, being elsewhere when neighbours knocked with problems. Neighbours noticed. Some pitied her, others whispered, not cruelly, but not kindly either. A few offered what they could, a cup of ground crayfish, an afternoon of child-minding, a quiet word that meant, "I see you," without making a demand that something be done about the seeing. Then came the pregnancy. Chidinma had known and had chosen not to know for weeks, because knowing meant adding to the calculation a variable that the current version of the equation could not hold. She told Abel on a Sunday evening, plainly, without drama, as information rather than appeal. Abel said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "God will provide." Chidinma looked at him. She had the expression of a woman who knows exactly what those 3 words mean in the context of a man who has long since outsourced the practical work of provision to the theoretical availability of divine intervention. She said nothing. She went back to the kitchen. She had a fire to tend. Even with the new pregnancy making itself known each morning in the nausea of a body building something new while running on insufficient fuel, Chidinma continued. The farm did not pause for pregnancy. The school run did not pause. The washing did not pause. The firewood did not pause. These were not negotiations. They were facts of her life, and her life had not asked her permission before delivering them. Mama Ugochi was 63 years old and had lived in the compound for 22 of those years, long enough to have watched 3 generations of marriages find their rhythms and lose them, and sometimes find them again. She had learned to recognize the specific signs of a household approaching a dangerous edge, and what she saw in Chidinma's compound that season alarmed her with the quiet certainty of someone who has seen this before and knows how it ends. She began leaving things at Chidinma's doorway: a small bunch of ugwu leaves, a handful of groundnuts, a cup of egusi, never making a ceremony of it. Just leaving them, the way you place a hand briefly on someone's shoulder without stopping to explain why. Mama Ugochi also spoke to Abel directly on 3 separate occasions and told him plainly that a man who allows his wife to carry the household alone while his health and strength remain intact is not resting. he is refusing. And refusing has a consequence that does not announce itself before it arrives. Abel listened. He thanked her. He did not change. But Mama Ugochi continued watching, because she understood that the value of a witness is not always in what they prevent, but in what they can confirm when the truth needs confirming. It was Chukwuemeka who asked the question. He asked it on an evening when he had returned from school to find his mother already back from the farm and already beginning the fire for dinner, while his father was visible through the open doorway of the hut, seated, resting. Chukwuemeka stood beside his mother at the fire and watched her hands, the cracked knuckles, the speed of a woman who does not have the luxury of doing anything slowly, and he said, in the direct language of a 7-year-old who has not yet learned the social rules that prevent this question. Mama, why is it always you that does everything? Why does Papa not help? Chidinma's hands paused for exactly 1 second. Then she resumed. She said, "Go and wash your hands for dinner." But the question stayed inside her chest for the rest of the evening, pressing against something tender, because a question you have been asking yourself in silence becomes more painful when a child asks it aloud, because then it is no longer private and you can no longer pretend it has not been asked. What the compound saw as indifference, Abel experienced as paralysis. Though this distinction would not have reduced Chidinma's burdens had she known it, he woke each morning already behind. Behind where he had expected to be at this stage of life, behind the version of himself that had once been able to meet his family's needs, behind the husbands of his contemporaries who had kept their footing while he had stood still. The shame of this was not abstract. It lived in his body. It made him heavy and slow and avoidant, in the way of someone who has decided unconsciously that if you do not move toward the thing you fear, it cannot fully arrive. He did not speak about any of this to Chidinma, partly because he did not have the words, and partly because he feared that speaking it aloud would make it more real than he could manage. And so it sat inside him, unspeakable, and expressed itself as the only thing that shame, unaddressed, reliably produces more of itself, covering more ground. 2 people can be suffering in the same house and never know it, because shame refuses to speak and strength refuses to ask, and between those 2 silences an entire family disappears. The afternoon before the afternoon, everything changed. Chidinma had walked further than usual for firewood. The closer bush had been picked over, and what remained was not worth the trip, so she had gone further an extra kilometre each way, which does not sound like much until you are 8 months pregnant, and the load you are carrying back is substantial, and the sun has made no accommodations for your condition. She came back later than she had intended, in the full heat of the afternoon, with the firewood balanced on her head and Nkechi against her back, and something, a heaviness, a pressure, a wrongness that she could not name, but that her body was insisting upon making each step more deliberate than the last. She reached the compound gate. She saw Abel under the shade. She did not speak. She took 3 steps past the gate, then 2 more, then 1 more, toward the doorway, and then the compound tilted. The firewood came down first. The bundle hit the red earth of the compound floor with the flat, scattered sound of things that were carefully arranged suddenly not being arranged at all, sticks rolling in several directions, the rope that had bound them snapping loose, the whole careful structure of her morning's effort coming apart in a second. Chidinma went down with it. not dramatically, but in the particular way that a body goes when it has been quietly negotiating with its own limits for too long and the negotiation finally fails. One moment she was walking. The next, she was on the ground, one hand braced against the dust, her knees folded under her, her head bowed. Nkechi, startled awake by the movement, began to cry. The sound was immediate and sharp, the cry of a baby who does not understand what has happened, but understands perfectly that something is wrong and that wrongness requires the voice at full volume. Chukwuemeka and Ada, who had come into the compound moments before from Mama Ugochi's doorway, stopped in the entrance of the gate. Ada's face went completely, terribly still. Chukwuemeka screamed. Not a word, just a sound. The sound of a 7-year-old who has crossed in an instant from childhood into something older and more frightening. Mama! Mama! The compound responded the way compounds respond to crisis immediately and from every direction. Doors opened. Women appeared. Mama Ugochi was out before most, moving faster than her 63 years usually permitted, calling back over her shoulder for water and for someone to go for help and for someone else to take the baby. And Abel stood up. He stood up from the wooden bench in the shade and he walked the 6 steps to where his wife lay on the ground of the compound he had shared with her for 9 years. And he knelt beside her, and for the first time in a very long time, he truly looked at her. Not past her, not through her, at her. He saw her face the colour wrong, the breathing wrong, the specific wrongness of a body that has been pushed far beyond where it should have been pushed. He saw her hands, the cracked knuckles, the calluses on the palms, the evidence written in skin and bone of everything she had been doing that he had not been doing. He saw the baby being lifted carefully from her back by Mama Ugochi, crying, and he saw Chukwuemeka standing at the edge of the circle of adults with Ada pressed against his side, both of them watching their mother on the ground, with expressions that no child should have to compose. And something moved inside Abel that had been still for a very long time. It was not a clean feeling. It was the feeling of something cracking open in a person who has been sealed shut. He felt shame, but a different shame from the one that had been making him smaller and more avoidant across these months. The shame that looks at what it has allowed and does not look away. There is a kind of seeing that only crisis makes possible. The seeing of a man who has looked past something for so long that it has to fall to the ground before his eyes will finally rest on it. Chidinma was not unconscious. She was in a state that the clinic nurse would later describe as collapse from exhaustion, compounded by the demands of late pregnancy on a body operating under sustained nutritional and physical stress. She was present, but at the edge of presence, in the blurred territory where the body demands that it be acknowledged, even if the mind has been insisting otherwise for months. Mama Ugochi organized the immediate response with the authority of someone who has been waiting for her competence to be called upon. She directed the men to form a carry 2 of them, using a cloth as a makeshift stretcher, and she organized the children into the care of a neighbor. And she told Abel, with a directness that did not invite negotiation, that he was to walk beside his wife to the clinic. Abel did not take a moment. He walked beside the stretcher. He held Chidinma's hand, the cracked, rough, overworked hand, and he held it the way a man holds something he has come close to losing and is only now understanding the value of. The clinic was a 15-minute walk. The compound had come out to watch them go, not rudely, but the way communities witness important things, with the quiet seriousness of people who understand that what they are seeing is not just a medical emergency, but the visible culmination of a story they have been watching develop for a long time. The nurse assessed Chidinma with the practiced speed of someone working in a facility that sees too much and has too little, and has made peace with both. Her diagnosis was not surprising to anyone who had been paying attention. Severe exhaustion, mild dehydration, elevated blood pressure, common in late pregnancy, and significantly worsened by physical overexertion and inadequate nutrition. The nurse said all of this to Abel when she came out to update him, and she said it in the particular tone of a medical professional who is providing clinical information but who is also, unmistakably, making a statement about the conditions that produce the clinical information. Abel sat on the wooden bench outside the clinic door and received it. He sat for 2 hours. He had nowhere to go and nothing to do and no way to escape into the elaborate nothing he had been doing for months. And so for the first time in a very long time, he simply sat with himself and with the truth of his situation. He thought about the note from Chukwuemeka's teacher that he had seen on the kitchen table and had not picked up. He thought about the days Chidinma had come home from the farm late and cooked despite the lateness and the exhaustion, and how he had eaten the food without comment and without the question that should have been the most natural question in the world. "Are you all right?" He thought about the cracked knuckles on her hands that he had noticed and then not noticed, the way you not notice a thing that would require something of you if you acknowledged it. He thought about Chukwuemeka's face at the compound gate. The boy had been 7 years old, and he had been afraid in the specific, formative way of a child who learns for the first time that the ground can move. Abel understood that he had contributed to placing that look on his son's face. Not by committing some dramatic cruelty, but by the long, quiet, consistent failure of showing up. He thought about the motorcycle man in the next compound who had mentioned twice that he could use a second driver on busy market days. Abel had heard this twice and had filed it in the category of things to consider later and had not considered it. He considered it now with the specific intensity of a man whose later has arrived and who is reckoning with what he allowed himself to postpone. The nurse came out and told him Chidinma was stable, that the baby was well, that she would need real rest for at least a week, and that the conditions that had led to today's collapse needed to not be the conditions she returned to. She said this last part, looking at Abel directly. Abel met her gaze. He did not look away. He was allowed in after another half hour. Chidinma was lying on the clinic bed with an IV line in her arm and the particular stillness of a body that has been forced to rest by circumstances since it would not rest by choice. She looked smaller than he had seen her look in a long time. Stripped of the forward momentum that she wore like a second wrapper, she looked like what she was, a woman who had been carrying far too much for far too long and whose body had finally said enough. He sat in the chair beside the bed. He placed his hand over hers, the rough, cracked, overworked hand, and he held it without speaking. After a while, Chidinma turned her head toward him. She looked at him with eyes that were tired but clear. "I cannot keep doing it like this," she said. Not angrily, not as an accusation, simply as a fact stated in the voice of someone who has finally decided to stop carrying an unsaid thing. I know, Abel said. I need you, Abel. Not just as the father of my children. I need you as my husband. I need you to be here. She paused. Really here? Abel looked at their joined hands, hers rough and worn, his softer than it should have been, and he said what was true and what was difficult to say. I stopped being here because I was ashamed. I lost the job, and I didn't know how to be the man I thought you needed. And instead of trying another way, I stopped trying altogether. That was wrong. I know it was wrong. He stopped. Then, I am sorry, Chidinma. Not the sorry that means nothing and changes nothing. I mean the sorry that I am going to have to prove. Chidinma was quiet for a moment. Then she said, That is the first honest thing you have said to me in a very long time. I know, he said again. They stayed like that for a while, the ivy dripping, the clinic sounds moving around them, the late afternoon settling into evening outside the window, two people who had been living beside each other without meeting each other, beginning carefully and without rushing to meet. Abel went to the motorcycle man the morning after Chidinma came home from the clinic. He went early before the compound had fully woken, in the grey pre-dawn that he had not inhabited in a very long time, and he knocked and he asked, and the motorcycle man, whose name was Emeka, said yes. The work was hard, and the income was modest, and it did not immediately solve the accumulated debts or fill every gap that the months of idleness had created. But it was something, and something in Abel's hands was a different thing than nothing, not just financially, but in every other register of a person's life. He came home in the evenings, tired, in the way that honest work makes a person tired, physically spent, but internally intact. The tiredness of a man who has produced something with his day rather than consumed it. Chidinma rested. This was its own kind of extraordinary, a week of actual rest, enforced partly by the clinic's instructions and partly by Mama Ugochi, who took the matter of Chidinma's recovery personally and stationed herself as a quiet guardian of it, managing the children and the cooking and the visitors with the authority of someone who has been waiting to be useful in this specific way and is not going to be moved from the assignment. The children felt the change before they could name it. Children always do they read the atmosphere of a household the way adults read words, with speed and accuracy and a comprehension that bypasses the explanations adults believe are necessary. Chukwuemeka noticed that his father came home in the evenings now and stayed. Ada noticed that the fire was sometimes already lit when their mother came to the kitchen because someone else had lit it. Nkechi noticed nothing specific, but was calmer babies absorb the emotional temperature of their environment with a sensitivity that has not yet been complicated by interpretation, and the temperature in the Okonkwo household was slowly changing. A home does not heal the way a wound heals suddenly, completely, leaving no trace. It heals the way a season changes, gradually, imperfectly, with days that feel like nothing is different and then mornings that are unmistakably new. The rent was addressed over 3 months, in installments that Mazi Chukwudi accepted without ceremony. The school fees were paid on time for the first time in 2 terms. The washing that Chidinma had been taking on for extra income was gradually reduced as Abel's transport earnings stabilized. Chidinma and Abel talked more than they had in years. Not always peacefully, there were evenings of difficult conversation, of things said that needed to be said and received. There were nights of cold distance that reminded them both how far they had travelled from each other. But there were also mornings when Chidinma woke and felt for the first time in a very long time that she was not the only person responsible for what happened next in her household. That feeling, the feeling of not being alone in your own life, is not a small thing. It is, for many people, the whole thing. The fourth child was born 6 weeks after the clinic Visit a Healthy Girl. They named her Olachi, meaning God's work is good. Chidinma had chosen it, not without complexity, not without the full knowledge of everything that had preceded this particular morning, but with the genuine recognition that something good had come through the worst of it. The compound, celebrated in the way of compounds with food and noise, and the particular warmth of a community that has watched a family struggle and is genuinely glad to see it come through. Mama Ugochi sat in the corner of the celebration with a cup of palm wine and the expression of a woman who has been proven right about something important and is too experienced to make a point of it. Abel came and sat beside her. "You told me," he said. "It was not a deflection. It was an acknowledgement." Mama Ugochi looked at him. "I told you," she agreed. Then, with the particular grace of an elder who has been around long enough to prefer futures to verdicts, "But you heard, eventually. That is what matters now." Abel looked across the compound at Chidinma, who was seated in the place of honour with Olachi in her arms, and the older children arranged around her. She looked up and met his eyes across the noise and the colour and the celebration. She did not smile immediately. She looked at him for a moment, first long enough to say what could not be said in a celebration, which was that the accounting between them was not closed, that the rebuilding was real work and would take real time. Then she smiled, small and real, and waited with everything that had happened to earn it. He smiled back the same way. Across the compound, Chukwuemeka was playing with 2 boys from the neighbouring household. He laughed at something, the full, open, unguarded laugh of a 7-year-old boy who is, in this moment, simply a 7-year-old boy and not the frightened child who had stood at the compound gate screaming his mother's name. That was the lesson Ogutano village drew from the story of Chidinma and Abel. Not a clean lesson, not a simple one, but the one that is true, that staying strong for your children does not mean carrying everything alone in silence. That the bravest thing a woman can do is sometimes not endure more, but say clearly what she needs. That the bravest thing a man can do is sometimes not defend his pride, but lay it down and pick up his responsibility instead. That the homes we build are only as strong as the honesty we are willing to bring into them, and that silence, no matter how well-intentioned, is never a substitute for the truth that 2 people owe each other when they have chosen to share a life, and that a family, even one that has been to the edge, can come back from it if the people inside it decide together to stop letting the weight fall on one person alone. Staying strong for your children does not mean carrying everything alone in silence. Sometimes, speaking up saves a home before it breaks completely. The weight of a family must be shared, because the person holding it all alone will eventually fall, and when they fall, everyone falls with them. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification, because we bring to you real-life stories that will inspire you. God bless you and see you in the next video. Please don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.